There's a photograph that survived the Monroe house fire of 1973. In it, a young boy sits on a porch swing, face turned toward the camera, eyes closed. But according to everyone who knew him, his eyes weren't closed. They were never there to begin with. His name was Thomas Monroe, and the people who met him never forgot what happened when he looked at them, or rather, when he faced them with the empty spaces where his eyes should have been, and told them things about themselves that no blind child should ever know. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is a story that most people in Millhaven, Pennsylvania never speak about. Not because they've forgotten forgetting would be a mercy, but because remembering Thomas Monroe means confronting something that doesn't fit into the world as we understand it. The Monroe family lived on the edge of town, in a farmhouse that had belonged to the family since 1892. They were quiet people, church-going, the kind of family that kept to themselves but never caused trouble. When Sarah Monroe became pregnant in the spring of 1961, the whole community celebrated. The Monroes had been trying for a child for 7 years, but when Thomas was born on November 14, 1961, the celebration stopped. The attending physician, Dr. Harold Kemper, would later tell his daughter that he'd delivered thousands of babies in his 40-year career, but Thomas Monroe was the only one that made him consider leaving medicine entirely. The infant had no eyes, not malformed eyes, not closed eyelids hiding underdeveloped organs. Where his eyes should have been, there was only smooth skin, as if his face had been sculpted by someone who'd forgotten that humans need eyes to see. The medical term is anophthalmia, the complete absence of ocular tissue. It occurs in roughly 1 out of every 100,000 births. But what happened with Thomas Monroe went far beyond any medical classification, because 3 days after his birth, while still in the hospital, Thomas turned his head toward his mother's voice and said her name. Not crying, not gurgling. He said, "Sarah," clear as daylight. A newborn speaking his mother's name is impossible. A newborn born without eyes turning toward sound with perfect accuracy is medically unusual. But both happening together, that was when Dr. Kemper made his first note in a private journal he kept hidden from the hospital records. The note read, "This child should not be able to do what he's doing." The Monroe family brought Thomas home on November 22, 1961. Their farmhouse sat 3 miles outside Millhaven proper, connected to town by a single dirt road that turned to mud every spring. Sarah Monroe's sister, Dorothy Whitfield, had come to stay with them for the first month, to help with the baby. Years later, in a recorded interview conducted by a local historical society in 1998, Dorothy would describe those first weeks with a tremor in her voice that never quite went away. Thomas never cried at night. Most newborns scream for food, for comfort, for the simple reason that they're adjusting to a world outside the womb. Thomas was silent, but Dorothy said the silence wasn't peaceful, it was aware. She described lying in the guest bedroom, listening to the absolute quiet coming from the nursery, and feeling watched. "I know how that sounds," she said in the interview, her hands shaking slightly as she held her coffee cup. "A baby without eyes can't watch anyone, but I'm telling you what I felt. He knew when you were in the room. He knew when you were about to leave. And he knew things about you that you'd never said out loud." When Thomas was 6 weeks old, Dorothy was folding laundry in the nursery while he lay in his crib. She was thinking about her husband, Richard, who'd been having an affair she'd only discovered 2 days earlier. She hadn't told anyone, not Sarah, not her parents, no one. She was standing there, folding a small blue blanket, tears running down her face in complete silence, when Thomas made a sound, not a cry, a word. He said, "Richard's leaving." Dorothy dropped the blanket. She walked to the crib and looked down at this infant, this impossible child with smooth skin where his eyes should have been, and he turned his face toward her with perfect precision. "He doesn't love anyone," Thomas said, in a voice that no 6-week-old child should possess. "He never did." Richard Whitfield filed for divorce 3 weeks later. He moved to Ohio with a woman named Patricia, whom Dorothy had never met, but whose name Thomas had mentioned twice more before Dorothy fled the Monroe house and never returned. In her interview, Dorothy was asked directly, "Do you think the baby could actually see into people?" Her answer was immediate. "I think that child saw everything, everything we hide, everything we bury, Everything we lie about, even to ourselves. And I think not having eyes somehow made it worse. Because when he faced you, you couldn't look away from those smooth spaces on his face, and you knew he was seeing the parts of you that you'd spent your whole life keeping secret. The Monroe family's parish priest, Father Michael Donnelly, visited the house when Thomas was 3 months old. It was a routine blessing for a newborn, something Father Donnelly had done hundreds of times. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon on a bright February day. He left 20 minutes later, got into his car, and drove directly to the diocese office in Harrisburg. According to diocesan records obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 2006, Father Donnelly requested an immediate transfer. In his written statement, he said only, "I cannot minister to that family. I cannot be in the presence of that child. May God forgive me for saying so." He was transferred to a parish in Maryland within the week. He never returned to Millhaven. He never spoke about Thomas Monroe again. By the time Thomas Monroe was 2 years old, the family had stopped inviting people to the house. Not because they were ashamed. Sarah and Robert Monroe loved their son with a fierceness that everyone in town recognized, but because every visitor left disturbed in ways they couldn't articulate. The mailman began leaving packages at the end of the driveway. The meter reader requested a transfer to a different route. Even the Sears catalog delivery man, a cheerful 60-year-old named Eugene Hatter, who'd worked the same territory for 30 years, refused to approach the Monroe porch after his one and only encounter with Thomas. Eugene described it to his wife, who later shared the story with her book club, and from there it spread through Millhaven like a slow-moving infection. He'd been carrying a new washing machine part up to the front door when he heard a small voice from the porch swing. Thomas was sitting there, face tilted upward as if watching clouds, though of course there were no eyes to watch anything. "You took the money from the register," Thomas said. His voice was clear, matter-of-fact, the way a child might comment on the weather. Eugene froze. 3 weeks earlier, he'd pocketed $17 from the Sears payment drawer. 17 exactly. No one knew. He'd told himself it wasn't really stealing, that the company owed him for years of underpaid labor. $17, Thomas said, still facing the sky. "You're going to take more. $43 next time, but you'll get caught, and your wife will leave you, and you'll die alone in a boarding house in Scranton wondering if any of it was worth it." Eugene Hatter didn't take the $43. He did get caught for the 17, and audit, 3 months later, found the discrepancy. His wife didn't leave him, but their marriage never recovered, and in 2003, Eugene Hatter died alone in a boarding house in Scranton, Pennsylvania. The boarding house owner found him sitting in a chair by the window, and according to the police report, there was a note on the table beside him. It read, "The boy was right about everything." Thomas didn't just know secrets, he knew futures. Or rather, he knew the paths people were walking toward, the inevitable conclusions of their choices. When he was 4 years old, a social worker named Margaret Chen came to evaluate whether Thomas could be enrolled in a special education program. Margaret had worked with disabled children for 12 years. She'd seen every condition, every challenge, every heartbreaking limitation that biology could impose on a developing human. She'd prepared herself for a child without eyes. She had not prepared herself for what happened when she sat down across from Thomas in the Monroe living room. He was playing with wooden blocks, building a tower with the focused concentration of any 4-year-old. Margaret introduced herself, explained why she was there, used her gentlest professional voice. Thomas didn't look up from his blocks, couldn't look up, of course, because looking requires eyes. But he stopped building. "Your daughter is sick," he said quietly. Margaret's hands went cold. Her daughter, Amy, was 7 years old and perfectly healthy. "She has something growing in her left lung," Thomas continued, still facing the blocks. "It's small now. If you take her to Dr. Morrison at Children's Hospital before June, they can remove it. If you wait until after June, she'll be dead before Christmas." Margaret Chen took her daughter to Dr. Morrison on May 23rd. They found a small tumor in Amy's left lung. It was removed on May 30th. The pathology report confirmed it was malignant, fast-growing, and would have been inoperable within 8 weeks. Amy Chen is alive today, a grandmother living in Portland, Oregon. She has no idea why her mother suddenly insisted on a full medical workup in the spring of 1965. Margaret never told her. But Margaret did write a letter to Sarah Monroe, thanking her and saying she would never forget what Thomas had done. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting that trembled across the page, Margaret added, "I don't know what your son is, but he saved my daughter's life, and I will never be able to repay that. I'm also never coming back to your house. Please understand. I can't face him again. I can't bear him knowing everything about me." Thomas Monroe never attended regular school. The Millhaven School Board met in closed session on August 9, 1966, to discuss his enrollment for kindergarten. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Minutes from that meeting, obtained through a public records request in 2009, show that Principal Vernon Hathaway argued strenuously against allowing Thomas into the classroom. His reasoning had nothing to do with Thomas's disability. "It's not about him being blind," Hathaway said, according to the minutes. "It's about what happens to people around him. We've all heard the stories. Every single person who spends time with that child comes away changed, disturbed. I have a responsibility to the other children, and I cannot, in good conscience, expose them to whatever that boy does to people." The school board voted 4-3 to deny Thomas enrollment. Sarah Monroe hired a lawyer. The case went to the state education department, and while bureaucrats argued about accommodation and discrimination, Thomas stayed home with his mother and continued to demonstrate abilities that had no rational explanation. He could navigate the farmhouse perfectly, never stumbling, never reaching out tentatively the way blind people do. He moved through rooms as if he had a complete mental map of every piece of furniture, every doorway, every obstacle. Robert Monroe, Thomas's father, installed a mirror in the hallway as a test. Thomas walked past it one morning, stopped, and said, "I'm not in the mirror, am I?" Robert, standing behind him, felt his blood run cold. "No, son," he replied quietly, "you're not." But it was what Thomas said about the mirror that Robert would remember for the rest of his life. "That's okay," Thomas said, his small face turned upward toward where his father's reflection should be visible. "Mirrors show what people want to see anyway. I see what people actually are." He continued walking to the kitchen, leaving Robert standing alone in the hallway, staring at his own reflection and wondering what his son saw when he looked at him, or whatever Thomas did that resembled looking. By the time Thomas was 7, the state had mandated homeschooling with a special education teacher visiting 3 times a week. The first teacher lasted 2 sessions. The second lasted 1 month. The third, a woman named Barbara Yost, who'd taught blind and deaf children for 15 years, stayed for almost 2 years. Barbara was devoutly religious, a Methodist who attended service twice weekly and taught Sunday school. She believed she'd been called to help Thomas, that God had a purpose for this strange child. She approached her work with patience, compassion, and faith. And then, one afternoon in April of 1970, Thomas was working on a reading lesson he'd learned, Braille with unsettling speed, his small fingers moving across the raised dots as if he was reading something more than just the words on the page. Barbara was watching him, thinking about her own life, her own secrets. She was engaged to be married to a man named David Kowalski. The wedding was planned for July. She loved David, or she told herself she did. But there was another man, someone she'd met at a church conference, someone she couldn't stop thinking about, someone she knew she should forget. Thomas's fingers stopped moving across the braille. "You're going to call off the wedding," he said without preamble. "You'll tell David you're not ready." But that's not true. You're ready. You're just not ready for him. You're going to marry the other man, Paul is his name, and you'll be happy for 11 years. Then Paul will have a stroke and die while you're at your sister's house, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you could have saved him if you'd been home. Thomas tilted his head, those smooth spaces where his eyes should be somehow focusing on Barbara with impossible precision. "You'll blame yourself, but you couldn't have saved him. His brain was already bleeding before you left that morning. Some things can't be changed, Barbara. Only seen clearly." Barbara Yost called off her wedding to David Kowalski in May. She married Paul Henderson in September of 1971. They were happy for 11 years. Paul died of a stroke in October of 1982 while Barbara was visiting her sister in Ohio. Barbara sold her house, moved to Arizona, and never taught again. In a letter she wrote to Sarah Monroe in 1997, shortly before her own death, she said, Thomas showed me the truth of my life before I lived it. I've spent years trying to decide if that was a gift or a curse. I still don't know. But I think about him every single day. I think about those empty spaces on his face, and I wonder what he really was, what he really saw. And I thank God that I only worked with him for 2 years, because I don't think I could have survived any longer than that. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? In the autumn of 1971, a man named Dr. Lawrence Whitmore arrived in Millhaven. He was a researcher from Boston University, specializing in what he called extraordinary perceptual abilities. He'd heard about Thomas Monroe through a colleague who'd read Margaret Chen's confidential report about her daughter's diagnosis. Dr. Whitmore had spent his career studying people who claimed to have psychic abilities, precognition, or unusual sensory perception. He'd debunked dozens of supposed mediums, exposed 3 famous psychics as frauds, and written 2 well-regarded books on the psychology of belief. He came to Millhaven as a skeptic, convinced that Thomas Monroe was either a very intelligent child making lucky guesses or a family pulling an elaborate hoax. He left 3 days later, a changed man. His research notes from those 3 days were discovered in his office after his death in 2001. They make for disturbing reading. Day 1. Dr. Whitmore arrived at the Monroe farmhouse at 9 in the morning. He designed a series of tests to evaluate Thomas's abilities under controlled conditions. He brought sealed envelopes containing photographs that no one in the Monroe family could have seen. He brought objects hidden in boxes. He brought playing cards and dice, and everything a professional skeptic would need to expose a fraud. Thomas, now 10 years old, sat across from him at the kitchen table, face tilted slightly downward, those impossible smooth spaces where his eyes should be somehow creating the sensation of being watched. The first test involved 5 sealed envelopes. Inside each envelope was a photograph of a different person. Dr. Whitmore had selected them randomly from a university directory. No names, no identifying information on the outside. He placed the envelopes in front of Thomas and asked him to describe what was in each one. Thomas didn't touch the envelopes. He didn't need to. He pointed to the first envelope. A woman with brown hair. She's smiling, but she's not happy. She's pregnant, and she doesn't want to be. She's going to leave her husband in 3 months. Second envelope. A man in his 50s. He teaches chemistry. He's stealing from the department budget. Small amounts. He tells himself it's not really stealing because the university doesn't pay him enough. He's going to get caught next year and lose everything. Dr. Whitmore's hands were shaking by the third envelope. He opened all 5 after Thomas had described their contents. Every single description was accurate, not just the physical appearance of the people in the photographs, but details about their lives that Whitmore himself didn't know and had to verify later through private investigators. The woman was indeed pregnant and did leave her husband in February of 1972. The chemistry professor was caught embezzling in March of 1973 and lost his tenure, his pension, and his reputation. But it was Dr. Whitmore's own notes from that first day that reveal his deteriorating composure. "This isn't cold reading," he wrote. "This isn't statistical probability or lucky guessing. This child is accessing information that shouldn't be accessible. How? The absence of eyes should make this impossible, not enhance it. Unless, and here the handwriting becomes almost illegible, unless the eyes were the limitation all along." Day 2. Dr. Whitmore brought no tests. He simply sat with Thomas and asked him questions. "How do you know these things? How do you see without eyes?" Thomas's answer was recorded in Whitmore's notes verbatim. "I don't see like you see. You look at the outside of things, the shapes and colors and surfaces. I see what's underneath. I see what people are made of, the choices they've already made, and the choices they're going to make. I see the truth of them, Dr. Whitmore. And the truth is always sadder than people want to believe." Dr. Whitmore asked the question that every visitor eventually asked. "What do you see when you look at me?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're going to write about me. You're going to write a book about what you found here, but you're never going to publish it. You're going to hide the manuscript in a safe deposit box because you're afraid of what people will think. You're afraid they'll call you crazy. You're afraid they'll take away your career, your reputation, everything you've built. And you're right to be afraid, because if you publish what you know about me, they will destroy you." Thomas tilted his head, and somehow Dr. Whitmore felt the full weight of that eyeless gaze. "But you'll die wishing you'd been braver. You'll die knowing you hid the most important discovery of your life because you were more afraid of being mocked than of leaving truth buried." Day 3. Dr. Whitmore's final note is dated October 16th, 1971. It reads, "I'm leaving today. I can't stay in this house anymore. Thomas Monroe is not a child with a disability. He's something else entirely, something that sees through the curtain of reality we've all agreed to believe in. I came here to debunk a myth, and instead, I've found something that unmakes everything I thought I understood about consciousness, perception, and the nature of human awareness. I'm going to write this all down. I'm going to document everything, and then I'm going to lock it away, because Thomas was right. I'm a coward, and the world isn't ready for what that child represents." Dr. Lawrence Whitmore died in 2001. His manuscript, titled "The Boy Who Saw Truth," was found in a safe deposit box in Boston. It has never been published. The Monroe family was given a copy. They burned it without reading it. Thomas Monroe turned 12 on November 14th, 1973. There was no party, no celebration beyond a small cake that Sarah baked, and the three of them, Thomas, Sarah, and Robert, shared in the kitchen. The family had become almost completely isolated by then. Robert still worked at the mill in town, but he spoke to no one about his home life. Sarah ordered groceries by phone and had them delivered to the end of the driveway. Thomas had no friends, no teachers anymore, no contact with anyone outside his immediate family. The house on the hill had become a kind of fortress, protecting the world from Thomas, or protecting Thomas from the world, no one could quite say which. On the night of November 20th, 1973, the Monroe farmhouse caught fire. The official report from the Millhaven Fire Department states that the blaze started in the kitchen, likely from a faulty electrical wire in the wall. The house was old, the wiring was original to 1892, and it had been a disaster waiting to happen for decades. The fire spread quickly through the dry wood frame. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the entire structure was engulfed. Robert Monroe was working the night shift at the mill. Sarah and Thomas were home alone. Neighbors, the nearest lived half a mile away, reported seeing the flames around 11:30 at night. They called the fire department but didn't approach the house. Later, when asked why they didn't try to help, they all gave variations of the same answer. They were afraid, not of the fire, of what they might find inside. Firefighters found Sarah Monroe's body in the upstairs hallway. She'd died from smoke inhalation. The medical examiner determined she'd been overcome by smoke while trying to reach the stairs, trying to get out. But here's what doesn't appear in any official report, what only exists in the private conversations between the firefighters who were there that night. Sarah's body was positioned as if she'd been crawling away from Thomas's bedroom, not toward the stairs, as if she'd been trying to escape from something inside the house, not from the fire itself. Thomas's body was never found. The fire burned hot enough to collapse the entire second floor into the first, hot enough to reduce most of the structure to ash and twisted metal. The official conclusion was that Thomas's remains had been completely consumed by the fire, that a 12-year-old child's bones had been incinerated so thoroughly that nothing remained. The medical examiner signed off on this explanation. The case was closed. Thomas Monroe was declared dead, victim of a tragic house fire. May he rest in peace. But Robert Monroe never believed it. In the years after the fire, before his own death from a heart attack in 1989, Robert told a story to only a handful of people. He told them that the day before the fire, Thomas had said something strange at breakfast. "You're going to be free soon, Dad," Thomas had said, his face turned toward his father with that terrible eyeless precision. "You and Mom both, you won't have to carry this anymore. You won't have to live with what I am." Robert had asked what he meant. Thomas just smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and said, "The fire will set you free, but I'm not going to burn. I'm going somewhere else, somewhere I'm needed." Robert claimed that 3 weeks after the fire, he received a letter. No return address, postmarked from Pittsburgh. Inside was a single sentence in handwriting he didn't recognize. "I'm okay, Dad. Don't look for me. Some people need to see what I see. I have work to do." Robert kept that letter in his wallet until the day he died. After his death, his brother cleaned out his apartment and found the wallet. The letter was gone, just an empty sleeve where it should have been, as if it had never existed at all. In the years that followed, there were reports, unconfirmed, unverified, the kind of stories that spread through small towns and then fade into folklore. A boy without eyes seen walking along a highway in West Virginia. A child matching Thomas's description living with a family in Kentucky who claimed he'd wandered to their door and they'd taken him in. A teenager in Michigan who worked at a diner and could tell customers things about themselves they'd never told anyone. None of these stories were ever proven. None of them led anywhere concrete. But in 1991, a woman named Helen Pritchard was dying of cancer in a hospice in Erie, Pennsylvania. She'd been a nurse in Millhaven back in the 60s, had seen Thomas Monroe once as an infant. On her deathbed, morphine-addled and slipping in and out of consciousness, she told her daughter about a visitor she'd received the previous night. A young man, she said, maybe 19 or 20 years old. No eyes, just smooth skin where the eyes should be. He'd sat beside her bed and held her hand and told her that death wasn't frightening, that it was just stepping through a door into a room she'd been preparing for her whole life. He told me everyone I'd ever loved was waiting, Helen whispered. He told me their names. He told me what they wanted to say to me. She died peacefully 4 hours later, a smile on her face. The hospice had no record of any visitor that night. The doors had been locked. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving Helen's room. But her daughter swears her mother wasn't hallucinating, that the peace on her face was real, that someone had been there to guide her through that final door. The question that haunts everyone who ever encountered Thomas Monroe isn't whether he was real. The medical records, the testimonies, the documented predictions all confirm he existed. The question is, what was he? What does it mean that a child born without eyes could see more clearly than anyone with perfect vision? What does it mean that the absence of something we consider essential for perception actually enhanced his ability to perceive? There are no easy answers. The medical community has no explanation for Thomas Monroe. Ophthalmia is well documented. Children born without eyes develop heightened senses of hearing and touch. They navigate the world through sound and tactile feedback. They don't predict the future. They don't know strangers' deepest secrets. They don't describe people's faces with perfect accuracy or tell you the exact moment your life is going to fall apart. Thomas Monroe wasn't just blind. He was something else entirely, something that our science and our understanding of human consciousness has no framework to contain. Some people who knew him believed he was cursed. Others believed he was blessed, that God had taken his eyes but given him something more valuable in return, the ability to see truth without the distortion of physical sight. Father Donnelly, before he died in 1994, gave one final interview to a Catholic magazine. He was asked about Thomas Monroe. His answer was careful, measured, but underneath it you could hear the fear that had never quite left him. I think that child saw the world the way God sees it, Father Donnelly said, without illusion, without the lies we tell ourselves, without the comfortable fictions we build to make life bearable. And I think that's why being near him was so disturbing. Because none of us want to be seen that clearly. None of us want our truth exposed like that. But there's another possibility, one that's darker and harder to accept. What if Thomas Monroe wasn't seeing truth? What if he was seeing probability, the likely outcomes of people's choices mapped out across time? What if his brain, deprived of visual input, had rewired itself to process information in a completely different way, to read the patterns of human behavior so precisely that he could predict futures with devastating accuracy? Neuroscientists have documented cases of blind individuals developing extraordinary abilities in other sensory areas. The brain is plastic, adaptive, capable of reorganizing itself in response to injury or absence. But even the most extreme cases of neuroplasticity don't explain Thomas Monroe. They don't explain how he knew about Richard Whitfield's affair when Dorothy hadn't told anyone. They don't explain how he diagnosed a tumor that hadn't been discovered yet. They don't explain the letter Robert received 3 weeks after a fire that should have killed his son. In 2017, a podcast called Forgotten Cases did a 2-part episode on Thomas Monroe. They interviewed everyone they could find who'd had contact with him or his family. Most people refused to participate. Those who did speak had a strange consistency in their testimonies. They all said the same thing in different ways. Being near Thomas felt like being seen through. Like he wasn't looking at you but into you, past all the defenses and performances and carefully constructed versions of yourself you present to the world. It's like he saw your soul, one woman said. And your soul was never as good as you wanted to believe it was. The podcast ended with a question they couldn't answer. Is Thomas Monroe still alive? If the fire didn't kill him, if that letter Robert received was real, then somewhere out there is a man in his early 60s, walking through the world without eyes, seeing things the rest of us are blind to. Maybe he's helping people, the way he helped Margaret Chen's daughter. Maybe he's just existing, carrying the burden of seeing truth in a world built on comfortable lies. Or maybe he died in that fire after all. And everything that came after the reports, the sightings, the deathbed visitor, is just the kind of mythology that grows around people who never quite fit into the normal categories of human experience. What we do know is this: the Monroe farmhouse was never rebuilt. The land sat empty for 20 years until the county seized it for unpaid taxes and sold it at auction. The new owners tried to build a house there in 1996. The construction workers quit after 3 days. They said the land felt wrong, that they heard voices in the foundation, that they saw things moving in the corners of their vision that weren't there when they turned to look. The foundation was poured, but the house was never finished. It stands there still, an abandoned concrete shell on a hill outside Millhaven, Pennsylvania, a monument to a family that disappeared into tragedy and mystery. And sometimes, on certain nights when the wind moves through the empty fields and the old-timers in Millhaven are feeling talkative after a few drinks at Murphy's Tavern, someone will tell the story of Thomas Monroe. They'll talk about the boy born without eyes who could see everything. They'll talk about the things he knew, and the lives he changed, and the fire that either killed him or set him free. And then they'll go quiet for a moment, and someone will inevitably ask the question that no one wants to answer. If you met him today, if that eyeless face turned toward you and he started to speak, would you want to hear what he had to say? Would you want to know your truth, laid bare, stripped of all illusion? Most people, if they're honest, would say no, because Thomas Monroe's real gift or his real curse wasn't that he could see the future, it was that he could see us as we actually are. And that's a sight most of us spend our entire lives trying to avoid. The photograph that survived the fire, the one of Thomas sitting on the porch swing, hangs in the Millhaven Historical Society. His face is turned toward the camera, those smooth spaces where his eyes should be creating the illusion that he's looking directly at whoever's viewing the picture. People don't look at it for very long. They glance at it, then turn away, unsettled by something they can't quite name. Because even in a photograph, even decades after his disappearance, Thomas Monroe still has the power to make you feel seen. And being truly seen, completely seen, is one of the most terrifying experiences a human being can endure. Thank you for watching. If this story disturbed you, if it made you think, if you felt that cold recognition that comes from encountering something true and terrible, leave a comment below. Tell us, do you believe Thomas Monroe really existed? Do you think he survived that fire? And if he did, if he's out there somewhere still seeing the truth that the rest of us are blind to, would you want to meet him? Subscribe for more forgotten stories, more buried histories, more truths that were never meant to surface. Because the past is never as dead as we pretend it is, and some stories, once uncovered, never let you go.